My dear students, near and far, past and present, I want to talk with you about a problem for biblical interpretation that really bothers me. It bothers me so much I sought out a book to counsel me. The book did not cure me, but I feel a little bit better. I wonder if you will too, or if you share my problem. I want to give a brief review of the entire book by way of just reviewing the problem. As we have discussed here on the channel in the past, link below, perhaps the most fundamental problem for biblical interpretation is the contention, both ancient and contemporary and everywhere in between, that actually, in the end, we don't even need to interpret at all. Why? Because meaning is, in this view, I guess, not even so much objective and we have to discover it, but just that it's like beamed out and some people just know it, and interpretation is humanity's failed attempt to try to thwart God, or something like that. So that's one, and there are various ways of talking about this problem, where it comes from and how to fix it. But here's the other one, and this is the one that I'm jazzed about at the moment, that I think is so difficult. It's the interpretive problem that says all interpretations, all readings, because we all come from some personal, embodied, human, emotional, perspectival, linguistic perspective, because we're all embedded with a series of assumptions and pre-understandings and things like that, every interpretation can be really nothing more than just your interpretation. In other words, all interpretation lives within a world of perspectival relativism. Relativism. So challenge number one, we don't need to interpret at all. Challenge number two, it's all just relative to your identity or to your social position. That first problem doesn't really tempt me that much. I was able to make a breezy video making fun of it and sort of getting us into the right mood to realize that we do need to interpret. It just seems empirically wrong. I mean, the idea that you don't need to interpret at all, in summary, seems just like a smokescreen for smuggling in your own very much an interpretation style views. Or it's just really naive or arrogant. Or another angle on the problem that I find really fascinating, perhaps some of you have read this book by Christian Smith called The Bible Made Impossible. I would totally recommend it no matter what your perspective. I'll put a link down below. He takes up an argument that many have made about the Bible, namely that the Bible has absolutely perfect perspicuity, that, in other words, that the Bible is completely clear. Maybe you've heard a saying like, the Bible is so clear, so easy to understand, even a child could understand it. And Christian Smith makes, I think, a valid argument, at least to think about, a very savvy argument, which is, if that's true, if the Bible speaks with total clarity, why do so many people disagree so intensely about so many of its meanings, of its interpretations? I mean, there are only two, and they definitely do. That's an objective fact. So there are only really two options here. Option one, the Bible is actually not clear, requires interpretation, okay? I thought I'd add this because that was an angle I didn't mention in my earlier video on this topic. Why do we even need interpretation at all? The Bible is not clear. People disagree about it, and that is a very basic reason that we need interpretation, okay? Not clear on its own terms. So in other words, the claim that the Bible is so clear and doesn't need the interpretation is just simply objectively false. Or, and this one's really fascinating, and I haven't met too many people that will go hard on this, but a couple of people out there on YouTube no doubt would. It's the idea that people do disagree about the Bible, but those who disagree with probably you, your interpretive enemies, are actually satanically deluded, which is the only way they could miss the obvious, clear, objective interpretation which you so perfectly embody. So he says these are really the only options that we can come up with to deal with the fact that people do really seem to disagree. Either that the clarity just isn't there, or your opponents are satanic. Okay. But this second problem, this is the purpose here, this relativism, this gets under my skin. Why? It just feels more real to me. It feels like more of a problem. We see this in the contemporary world, this rise of identity culture, of niche identities, of niche communities, the lack of shared consensus about truth. I'm just old enough myself to have watched this sense of the world crumble, the sense where we could all sit down with the family around the TV at prime time and watch the news. Maybe there were 2 or 3 news channels and we all watched it and kind of got the same information. The internet didn't exist when I was a child. Or it existed, but only for military people or something, okay? I got my first email address when I was in college. And so I guess I'm just part of that generation that grew up, essentially without the internet and now lives my life as an adult with it. And I can see this difference, this past consensus. Maybe this past consensus wasn't even that great. Maybe getting older people, we idealize the past. But maybe that past consensus was fake, or it was actually not a consensus at all, or it operated based on fear, or just not even knowing what other people thought. So I think it's very practical. I don't think you have to try to be a terrible person to break the consensus and come up with all these niche identities and communities. You just have to not have social media or the internet or streaming news services and things like that. And there are certain things that you just don't know. So because of that environment, I feel like this problem of relativism, of course you say that you believe that women should not preach or speak in church because you are embedded within a community like this. Or, how many times do we hear these kinds of statements in popular interpretation of the Bible or on YouTube or social media? Well, as a fill-in-the-blank race, fill-in-the-blank gender, my community, and then it's like you have like this perspective, okay? So does everything just reduce down to that? And ultimately there's nothing else. Obviously the challenge of relativism as a philosophical idea for morality is a difficult one to just like cover in a short video like this, so I can't. I just want to think about it in terms of the interpretation of the Bible. Has anyone tried to tackle this? I think that there are other books and people that have tackled this. Would be interested to hear your suggestions for what you've read that tackles this down below. But I found this book. This is by Merold Westphal, who's a professor at Fordham University for a long time, distinguished professor of philosophy at the time he wrote this book, now retired. It's called Whose Community? Which Interpretation? Philosophical Hermeneutics for the Church. I read it not knowing much about it, but just knowing that it maybe tackled this problem just by the title. Okay, how do you interpret? Well, which community are you from? Well, let's interpret. Well, which interpretation? So I thought it was right there in the title, and I love a title like that. So I wanted to give you all just a quick review of what he says and what his argument is. And it's dense in places. It's a very thoughtful book. And the conclusion, I don't know, how satisfying is it? Well, let's see if we can get there. Ultimately, what Westphal is giving us, he's giving us a pitch to take up the philosophical hermeneutics of a philosopher, one of the most prominent of the 20th century, Hans-Georg Gadamer. I'll put a link down below to Gadamer. You can read some biography, who was born in the year 1900 and died in 2002. And yes, that is correct. He was 102 years old. His magnum opus is called Truth and Method, published in 1960, I believe, for the first time or thereabouts, translated into English and so on. And he taught at many universities, but I think Heidelberg was the place where he taught the longest, in Germany. I want to bring you three big moments from this book in which Westphal pitches to us Hans-Georg Gadamer as the solution to interpretive relativism. And he does so by suggesting that there are kind of like two kinds of relativism, and there's a kind that we should definitely be okay with, and there's a kind that we shouldn't be okay with. So I'm going to bring you three big moments under headings from this book by way of review. Okay, so first, moment number one. Westphal argues that if we claim to be overcome by relativism or defeated by a certain kind of relativism too quickly, we're practicing a form of sloppy thinking. He says that almost any text or artifact, and this is not an original argument, but I thought it's a good place to start, any text or artifact provides guardrails or provides a kind of a context or some material thing against which we have to react, and we cannot reasonably react in just literally any way whatsoever. Total pure relativism. He gives this example, which was made famous by the philosopher Wittgenstein. Did you ever see this thing before? What is it? Is it a duck or is it a rabbit? I guess maybe more like a rabbit if you tilt it, see the duck's beak, or it could be the rabbit with the face of the rabbit and the ears. Okay, you could say that this is a duck or a rabbit. You probably couldn't say that this is a semi-truck. Okay, well, what if you could? How about it's a house with a pointy roof with a chimney? Okay, how about this is a 5,000-word short story? No, like there are certain things that just, you can say whatever you want. We know that. It's a free country, or at least it used to be. But there's certain things you just can't claim reasonably. You could reasonably claim this is a rabbit or a duck, or maybe something else, who knows, a schematic or a map for something. But it has to correspond in some way to the guardrails it itself does provide materially. So point number one, Westphal says, Brian, don't panic. Just don't fall for sloppy thinking, okay? Don't get sloppy. Don't start to get all into despair and nihilism, which are two of my vices for sure sometimes. And don't just say, well, okay, just be thoughtful, calm down, look at the thing itself. Second, he reviews options that people have tried in the history of biblical interpretation to combat relativism from a variety of perspectives. For example, he kind of picks up his story of interpretation in the Romantic period with the idea of what he calls romantic psychologism. In the Romantic period, the idea was you could interpret, you could fight the idea that just any interpretation was valid by just going back to the author. Romantic scholars picked up the saying of the Renaissance, ad fontes, back to the sources. You go back to the source, you go back to the author, okay, and you do your very, very best to get inside the author's mind and the author's heart. Like say you're reading the book of Jeremiah. You try to just embody the very presence and spirit of Jeremiah the prophet. You read it so much, you just try to become him and think his very thoughts. And by doing that, you can get a kind of like grasp on what he was saying that will get you at the real heart of the truth of the matter, okay? Scholars like, he identifies Schleiermacher, whom we've talked about before, I think, in some way here on the channel, as well as Dilthey, D-I-L-T-H-E-Y, a scholar I haven't looked into very much at all, as those who kind of bought into this in different ways, or who really wanted to produce what they thought was a general hermeneutics. In other words, there's no special reading of the Bible or of any particular literature or art. It's a kind of like a general theory of interpretation that can get you a correct answer. And Dilthey in particular really was famous for working hard to get us to the place where we could get the interpretation of a book, of words on a page, somehow on par with the rising prestige of the natural sciences, right? You get a scientific reading of a text, and that will get us there. To read a little bit here, he says, this is from page 31, a fourth and final feature of romantic hermeneutics is its objectivism. Dilthey is especially insistent that interpretation be scientific, so that its findings may be objective and rise to the level of universal validity. These are all quotes from Dilthey's essay, The Rise of Hermeneutics. The prestige and power of the natural sciences seem to suggest that rational respectability requires that the disciplines that relate to distinctly human meaning, Geisteswissenschaften, humanities or human science, must aspire to a comparable objectivity, especially against the possibility of some sort of historical relativism. So in other words, let's just make this more like the sciences. And we see a long history of this in academia. For Westphal, though, no, that's not the way. It's not going to work. How about this method? He points to a book that I'd never heard of before. I'm really interested now to read it, by an author named E.D. Hirsch, Validity and Interpretation, 1967. Hirsch's project to try to fight relativism was that you could get a universally valid interpretation which would amount to the author's public, shareable, intended meaning through a series of basically objective interpretation moves, that would just get you there. And ultimately, this is where objectivity and interpretation lies for Hirsch and those like him. And this is how you fight relativism. It's about authorial intention, which you can see is kind of like the romantic idea. You get inside the author's heart, you get inside the author's mind, and what the author meant, that's what is real. Without that, the reasoning might go, you have a text, but like who cares about the text? It's just the reader. The reader comes not just to hold hands with the text or participate with it, but just dominate the text entirely with her or his own ideas. Okay. The big problem here, as Westphal points out, was the whole death of the author movement. I mean, you had all these French theorists, Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and many others that really made this authorial intention thing very difficult philosophically. My own opinion, by the way, for what it's worth, yeah, the death of the author problem was really real. I mean, to try to get objectively back to authorial intention in even most cases or every case, and I mean, given some forms of art as well or poetry, I mean, how can we even talk about authorial intention? Sometimes these things are very complicated, especially when we have ancient and ambiguous texts. We have trouble sometimes just even in translating the language that they wrote in. Now we're trying to get inside of their soul to figure out what they intended by this stuff. Okay. So it's a particular problem for the Bible, and it's a particular problem for an ancient context. What we probably will end up needing, Westphal points out, is something like a double hermeneutics, What did God say to them, best as we can, get into that world, do the historical critical method, do the scholarly thing, and then what does that now mean for us? And even to bridge that gap between what did it mean for them and what did it mean for us is to do an active interpretation that is not just relying on some technical objective speech act that someone did a long time ago. It's about us now. I mean, say you want to think about, I don't know, AI and its suitability for our world and our spirit, or nuclear weaponry or nuclear energy or something like that. Where are you going to find this in the Bible? They didn't speak to it. There is no authorial intention there. Yes, there are principles and there are wisdom things, but like, you're not going to find every exact issue. So you're going to have to do this double hermeneutics and make this leap. Therefore, the intentions of authors are not just going to get us objective interpretations on many things that are going to bother us as Bible readers. It's just a fact. Okay, finally then, what is the solution? What is the solution then? About halfway through this book, he turns then to Gadamer. And essentially Hans-Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method, the method there is what he's offering to us as the solution. What is that method? I'm simplifying it greatly, and I'm not doing this directly from Truth and Method. I'm doing it from Westphal's presentation to us of Truth and Method. But basically for Gadamer, meaning is something that's co-determined, co-created as a partnership between a text and a reader. It's a kind of a dance. It's a kind of a journey, okay? This is, Westphal says, a relativist hermeneutic. He says if you can handle it, if you're brave enough to call it that and not get afraid of the word relativist, right? It is relative. It's relative to the text and the reader and the dance that you do with the text, but it's without being sheer relativism. Remember, don't go back to the sloppy thing where just anything can mean anything, right? There is a guardrail, or there is a beginning point, certainly the historical or objective reality of the words on the page and the thing in front of you. What does this mean? Ultimately, it means we're going to have a variety of correct interpretations, right? We're going to have people that fall into different kinds of groups. I mean, he gives this a couple of times, Westphal does, this idea of 3 groups. This is based on Gadamer. Group 1 is going to be people who just like don't get it. They're bad. You know, they don't understand the words that they're reading. They just don't get it. There's going to be another group though that do get it, but their understanding is just like very wooden, or they fail in some way to just do it skillfully. And then the third kind are going to be those who are right, who are faithful to the meaning of the text and what the author had said, and maybe even authorial intentions. They're going to be effective at conveying this. But as you can hear, this is kind of vague, so it's going to be lots of different ways that this could happen, right? He says we're going to have to not just, say, well, the author had he goes on this long thing about Hirsch here, this long complex thing about how Hirsch, remember back Hirsch was the one who wanted to make interpretation totally objective. Hirsch wanted to make the distinction between meaning and significance. So meaning is that which is represented by a text. It's what the author meant by the use of a particular sign sequence. It is what the signs represent. Significance, on the other hand, names a relationship between that meaning and a person or a conception or a situation or indeed anything imaginable, right? Or to put this last point more succinctly, significance is a meaning's value or its present relevance. So Hirsch is saying we need to, the author's meaning can be objectively identified, and the relativity of significance to numerous different contexts will result in an anything goes relativism, according to Hirsch, if it is not rigorously excluded. So we're going to get rid of significance, right? It's just meaning. And Westphal says, Gadamer says, no, there's a collapse between meaning and significance here. We have to admit that they go hand in hand, they work together, and that this is just the dance we're going to be in. He gives a final example, Westphal does, as an illustration. He brings up this thing called the Joint Declaration on Justification. This was an obscure document produced in 1999 by Catholics and Protestants, working in a way that he thought, I guess, exemplifies the kind of dance we might have to do and the way we might have to cooperate in community with each other to come to interpretation. I'm going to kind of skip that because I think it was not super compelling, but the last 20 pages or so of the book, he gives a series of points, which I think I can summarize for you in conclusion here, that are maybe boring, but I think maybe profound points that can guide us, at least according to Westphal. How do we, if we're gonna avoid relativism but do a relativist hermeneutic, what kind of attitude do we have to have in general in order to practice this? Number one, we're gonna have to acknowledge the humanity in all of this. We're gonna have to acknowledge that we are, after all, human beings. These are human-centered and fallible models that we have in the Gadamerian world of meaning, okay? And we're gonna have to admit that. And that human element, we can't escape it, means several things. One, or I should say A, I just said the other one was one. 1A, these are all subordinated under the fact that we are human. We're gonna have to live with other people. We're gonna have to live with disagreement. We're gonna have to do this with charity and with listening. I know this is very boring, right? Number 3, we're gonna have to strive to tell the story of what others think. And Westphal repeats this several times as a principle of what it means to listen well. I'm gonna have to strive to represent what you think, if you disagree with me, in words and terms that I would agree with, that you're at least giving me a fair shake and you're representing my view fairly before you criticize it. He says we're gonna have to do that. From another philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, Westphal asks that we be open to the voice of the other in our immediate circumstance, the face of the other, their immediate presence, whoever they are. We're going to have to attend to them. We're going to have to seize the context of interpretation that we have. Where does all this occur? Well, Westphal says, don't overlook your family. Don't overlook your church. Like, your family and your church are the places where this kind of thing is probably going to occur. The church point is especially interesting because many of us who go to church weekly, or try to, myself included, love my church. It's like that's kind of the one place maybe where we go and hear someone give an interpretation of the Bible. But like, what happened to Bible studies or Sunday school or these kind of old-fashioned places where people used to do this kind of work? They used to be mandatory, at least growing up in church. This Christian education system used to be there, and now it just kind of isn't in most churches. So like, where does this exactly happen? Okay. But he says we have to grasp onto the context we have, and we have to be there. We're still left, he wants to point out, with the double hermeneutic I mentioned earlier. What did they say then? What does it mean to us now? Unless the text, unless for you, your whole thing is just going to be about just locked in history. What did this author mean by this back then? Or on the other hand, if you're just going to say these words in the text don't mean very much, it's just about power. This is just about manipulation. These are free-floating signifiers. I will grasp onto them to just try to use them like a kind of currency to get things that I want. Unless you do one of those two extremes, you're going to be in this middle ground where you're going to have to be making this journey back and forth across this bridge. What did they mean? What do I mean? Right? There's no massive slam dunk here in the end for Westphal. There's no boom quotable moment, really. It's just ongoing, never fully finished, slow work. It's maybe not inspiring, but it might be all we have. And this might be all we have to essentially combat in our soul this fear that what we're participating in is just a kind of perspectival relativism. He says, well, we have the text and we have ourselves. And he ends the book by saying, how does this work feel to do that? Well, it feels frightening, but it also feels wonderful. And to hold those two things together, the frightening and the wonderful, I think is a good emotional stance to have as one reads the Bible.